tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. So it's a couple days after the May full moon of Visakha Puja or Vesak. It's Buddhist year 2568 in the Thai calendar, counted from the year of the Buddha's death. And so I want to share with you tonight some passages. I mostly want to read you from a book by the Nepali Newari poet from the mid-20th century named Chittadhar Hṛdaya. This is the text of the book. It's called The Epic of the Buddha. And although a more literal translation of the title is The Sweet Fragrance of the Buddha, the Sugata Saurabha. And Hṛdaya was a member of the Newari Buddhist community in the Kathmandu Valley. They've been native to the Kathmandu Valley in Nepal since time immemorial, and they are the last surviving group who's of Buddhists, South Asian Buddhists, who still uses Sanskrit as their core ritual and chanting language. So Buddhism, after it was transmitted to the Theravada countries of Sri Lanka, Thailand, Burma, Laos, Cambodia, in the early, really spreading through the early centuries of the Common Era, and then north into China through the travels and translation of Xuanzang and others in and around the 6th and 7th centuries, and up into the Himalayas, out up into Mongolia and Korea, Japan, by the thousands. By about the 10th, 11th century, Buddhism was really declining in India itself. And by about almost 1,000 years ago, Buddhism had almost completely disappeared in South Asia, in the land of its birthplace. Similarly, many of the tantric Hindu traditions went underground during the long Muslim empire in India. They didn't disappear completely. Many of them were preserved. Certainly they were preserved in Tibet and Nepal, and in Kashmir very strongly, in Ladakh very strongly. But while Buddhism really was preserved in diaspora, it really disappeared from India itself. And the Newaris in the Kathmandu Valley are kind of the last living thread of South Asian Buddhism. They're not Theravadan. They're not what we would call Mahayana. They're closer to Mahayana than Theravada, but they're really their own whole culture, Buddhist culture. And in the mid 20th century, there was a period of more authoritarian Hindu rule in Nepal, and the ruling group, the Rana, by about the late 1930s, made it illegal to write in the Newari language, in the native Nepali language of Nepāl Bhāṣā that the Newaris spoke. And there arose a resistance movement to preserve the language. And so this poet, Chittadhar Hṛdaya, was central to this resistance movement. And part of his work in his life was to preserve this native Nepali language. And so he wrote he wrote a poem um, called Hṛdaya, Motherless Child, in the late 1930s, for which he was arrested and thrown into prison for writing in his language. And so he was in prison from 1939, 1940 up until about 1946. I think maybe not quite so long, for a handful of years in there. And at times the prison was quite harsh. Um, and because he was in prison for writing, the guards were very vigilant. They weren't allowed any writing materials, and they weren't allowed paper, note paper. And so um, he he saved up tiny, tiny scraps of paper from like food wrappers and things, and he began to write an epic poem um, uh, telling the entire life story of the Buddha in Nepali Bhāṣā, in his language, writing on these tiny scraps of paper. And then he figured out that he had these little tins, like food tins, and they had a kind of removable tin bottom, and that he could stuff the bottoms of these tin cans with tiny pieces of paper, and then he would give the empty ones to his sister when she came to bring him his like treats. And so she would give him fresh tins, and he would give her these tins. And the guards would actually search the tins for paper, but they didn't find them. And so slowly over the course of some years, he wrote this entire epic poem. This is such a classic story, classic resistance story. He wrote an entire epic poem in his indigenous language on tiny scraps of, like food wrappers, smuggled them out to his sister, who recopied them out by hand. And when he was released from prison, he completed the poem, and it became this kind of his great masterpiece. It's full of Sanskrit poetry, and he was I want to say like literature nerd, but whatever term you want to use here. But he uses all these different formal Sanskrit poetic meters um, that are described in great detail in the Sanskrit literature, and he would note which ones he was using. So he was very precise about like this one's in this meter, this one's in this meter, and this ancient form, this ancient form, and he does a bunch of interesting things in it. Reading it, sometimes sometimes I kind of forget that I'm reading something that was written in the 1940s. Like it just sounds like an ancient epic poem. It has the same kind of tone that you might find, reading the Ramayana, or, one of the ancient verse epics. Some of the ancient verses attributed to the not attributed to the Buddha, but that were written somewhat later than the Buddha. This sounds very much like them, like the Buddhacarita or the Lalītavistara, some of the early biographies of the Buddha, very flowery, very almost romantic prose. Um, but but he was not actually trying to mimic completely the classical prose. He also had a political agenda, first of all, to preserve the language, but also to record his culture. And so the piece is famous for doing this thing, and I'll read you a little passage that speaks to some of this, where he elaborates on the Buddha's story, not by like making up new plot elements, but by filling in details, like domestic details of what the household was like. But instead of trying to describe the Buddha's, you know, uh, situation, 2,500 years ago, he describes essentially modern or slightly pre-modern Newari culture. He describes his own culture. And so there's a whole bit in here about how describing the young Buddha's education. And it describes all the subjects that he studied, including all the musical scales and modes that he learned. Um, and it's not a historical document. Hṛdaya is describing the musical scales and modes that a highly educated, and the Newaris were relatively, when they were not being oppressed, they were relatively well off, quite wealthy, a high caste subgroup within Nepal. So he's describing the education of a high caste Newari in the modern day. And so the text is both a portrait of Newari Buddhist culture now, or in the now of the 1940s, and at the same time this remembering, right? He's writing most of it from memory, right? He doesn't have a library to reference in prison, of the story of the Buddha. And I'll read you a passage that's clearly political, where he's describing a good political state. He's describing the state that the Sakyan Republic, ruled by the Buddha's father, how they governed. And it's clear that he's basically saying this is what a good state should be, and it's a fairly modern portrayal. So this is a translation by Todd Lewis and Subarna Mantuladhar of called The Epic of the Buddha, His Life and Teachings, Chittadhar Hṛdaya, written in 1940, from 1940 to 1946, in a Nepali prison. So here's how it begins. Chapter 1, Lumbini. Resplendent was lustrous Lumbini, fragrant from its exotic flowers, for it was here that our poet and the king of seasons made their first acquaintance. Holy is the grove between Kapilavastu and Devadaha, because just there was Lord Buddha born. The great raiment of the sky above seemed to encompass it on all sides. So verdant was the grove beyond, adorned with creepers, like a young lotus-eyed farm girl. Youthful, smiling, with her hair bedecked in flowers, she displayed her tender nature. Trembling like a young girl at the touch of her lover, the new buds and blossoms of the trees rustled with the passing breezes. Like youthful maidens laden with carnal desire, the trees bent down, heavy with fruit. In one place the cuckoos cooed, in another birds chirped, chili, chili. In the flowering grove the multicolored butterflies flitted. As peacocks danced nimbly among the coxcomb flowers, fawns scampered there to see this sight. Parrots were chattering in the branches overhead, but it was the trees abloom with buds and blossoms that seemed to sing. The black bees humming in the lush grove also pleased the ear, while their honey-drunken bunu bunu buzzing stirred the mind. Only from their fragrance could one know the yellow jasmine had bloomed, or else one would think them to be golden flower earrings. The entire forest was beautiful with the flowers of its fruit trees, as the sight of all the colorful blossoms dazzled the eyes. A blooming honeysuckle smiled, showing its flowers like teeth. Its fragrance was like the breath of the flowering lotus. A flock of swallows flew together in the autumn sky, like wedded daughters returning to their parents' home. Graceful rabbits were there too, fidgeting, or were they crystals fallen from the glittering moon? A monkey troop jumped from branch to branch, personified restlessness in material form. In one place, the female monkeys scurried as their young ones clung tight. In another, other monkeys swung around on creeper vines. As the wind then swept noisily through the freshly sprouted bamboo grove, their stalks swayed, sounding piri piri in grand welcome. The cool, clear waters flowing in the crystal stream sounded beautiful, to make a song pleasing to its sweetheart. The willows along its banks seemed to bend down as if to kiss it, but retreated a bit, chastened by the gentle breeze. It goes on like this for a long time. So this is the grove, the beautiful grove, where the Buddha is born. So uh, Queen Maya, the Buddha's mother, shows up with her entourage, lots more descriptions of beauty. And then in chapter 2, it's the ancient ancestry of the Buddha's family is described. And part of what's interesting about this chapter is that um, he links the Buddha to the ancient Hindu legendary um, dynasty, beginning with Manu, the layer down of the great laws, and the solar dynasty, it's called, the dynasty of Ikshvaku. And um, and then uh, stitches into this dynasty the story of Rama from the Ramayana, the story of Rama and Sita. And this is going to show up later in the text as well. When after the Buddha leaves home, the poet really devotes, like an entire chapter to Yashodhara's grief, his wife's grief at losing him, which is beautiful and sensitive and poignant, and and really gives her voice in a way that the early texts very rarely do. And one of the things she says in her complaint that the Buddha has gone off and left her is that that even Sita, when Rama was banished to the forest, was able to go with him, and how she would love to go with the Buddha into the wilderness, and she would live like an ascetic with him, and she would do that, and Sita did it, and she could do it too. And so there's this real weaving together that's quite rare in Buddhist literature, since most of the Buddhist literature we receive is ancient and happened before the development of modern Hinduism. So, to have here someone who's, fully conversant in, the whole body of the Hindu myths, and, the stories like the Ramayana, which they would have, grown up very, very deeply with, and just to weave it right into the story of the Buddha. Um, the Buddha in this family tree, ends up being a descendant of Rama and Sita. So here's a little bit of that. So it goes down through the dynasty of Ikshvaku to Kubera, and to Bira Raghu, who is the namesake of the Raghu dynasty. And then here's a bit of this. The very one who had beautiful and beloved Indumati as his great queen, whom he loved so deeply that they seemed as two joined in one mind and body, became the forebear of Dasharatha, and so of Rama, and this very Aja remained a reigning monarch who treated his subjects as his own children. Dasharatha, son of Aja and father of Raghava, had a household ever tranquil and serene, and his conjugal love shone like a broad flaming beacon, such that his queens, Kausalya, Sumitra, and young Kekai, bore him 4 sons, Rama, Bharata, Lakshman, and Satrughna. This king Dasharatha, a direct descendant of this solar dynasty, exhibited love for his son and died from the shock of his son's forest banishment. Rama, the mere saying of whose unforgettable name fills our hearts with reverence, was the light of Avadpura, the place where he spent his pleasant childhood. The one who did string the tremendous bow and win Sita's hand in marriage, also crushed the pride of Bhrigu and returned safely home. In compliance with his father's command, he gave up his kingdom, retreating into exile with Janaki and Lakshman to dwell in the Dandaka forest. Chaste Sita was kidnapped by Ravana, and it was impossible to win her release in negotiation. After winning Vibhishana over to his side and finding his enemy's locale, he vanquished Dashanana and had Vibhishana crowned as Lanka's ruler. After returning with his wife in their celestial chariot back home, having heard Sita's chastity questioned by a washerman, he drove his dear Sita out with Lakshman to forest exile, but later performed the horse sacrifice, having installed a golden statue with his own hands. He, in whose heart flowed the incessant river of loving affection for Sita, cared not for his own suffering in the forest, thinking that it was much smaller in scale compared to that of his countrymen. It was his regime that became well celebrated with the name of Rama Rajya. This Rama was much adored and remembered as the fragrance of this dynasty. Shining like the sun, India also shined on earth once this solar dynasty dawned, its brave and dedicated kings beloved by their countrymen. In this lineage there was also born a king, Sujata by name, who, to keep his promise, ordered his 5 sons banished to the forest. All of the exiled 5 sons, including Dhira, Opura, etc., took shelter in the hermitage of Kapila Muni, finding no other refuge. During their sojourn, they eagerly founded their own kingdom there and named it after the sage Kapila, hence Kapilavastu, seat of Kapila. And so to feel this text with, the Ramayana completely woven in, and actually in a very devotional way, woven into the Buddha's story, right? That it flows right into the founding of the city where the Buddha is born, Kapilavastu. You might also know, if you know the story of the Ramayana, that it was presented here in a non-supernatural way. Particularly no mention of Hanuman, the monkey god, leaping over the ocean. One of the things that Hṛdaya does throughout is that he emphasizes the Buddha and his story as a human story. The text is not about the superhuman or supernatural or divine or miraculous elements in the Buddha's story. And you can sense it here in the Ramayana, where none of the miraculous elements in the Ramayana are mentioned either. It's just Sita was kidnapped, they had a battle and won her back. No flying monkeys are mentioned. So a little more here. So here is the so here's a bit right after this part about Kapilavastu, where they're going to describe the state that the Buddha's father Suddhodana runs. And here you can see the political project of Hṛdaya coming through. So the mighty son, this is Simhahanu, had Suddhodana as his oldest son. Suddhodana becomes the Buddha's father. And this one became celebrated as the head of the Shakya Republic at Kapilapura. To establish the luster of his rule, he wed 2 kings, Maya and Gautami, who were faithful and dutiful to their honored spouse. Like twin moons sailing in the sky above the royal house, they suffused its atmosphere with radiant smiles, purity of heart, sweet natures, and serene conduct. Comparable to guardian gods in gallantry and Lakshman in fraternal love were his 3 brothers Dautodana, Shukrodana, and Amritodana. In consultation with them, he ran the state affairs, ever cooperating with foreign countries, noble ministers, and Shakya representatives. As the system of government was very good, tranquility always reigned in the country among its cheerful people. So through this passage, remember, this is a person who's been thrown in jail by a despotic regime. The taxes were not a heavy burden for the common folk. They had ample crops in their fields and cloth on their looms for making clothing. No building ever collapsed in the village or country. Even the renovation of dilapidated buildings was carried out by a building department. The workmanship of the able artists dazzled the eyes wherever they rested, on the temples or houses decorated with fancy artwork made of brick or stone. There was no trace of epidemic diseases, as the courtyards were clean. Still, the settlements all had health clinics that dispensed free medicines. The gutters in the alleyways and courtyards were clean and free from filth. Clean drinking water flowed in public wells, ponds, and taps, scattered everywhere as needed. For the convenience of weary travelers, there were halting places and inns. Lights illuminated the highways at night, dispelling the darkness. The whole country was crisscrossed with roadways that were paved and smooth. Cities, towns, and villages were well linked by streets and public paths beyond description. As all the many villagers had schools, no one chose to remain illiterate or lacked in education. For promoting female education, there were girls' schools everywhere. In courtyards big and small, young women trained in cooking, knitting, and weaving. Agriculture thrived there as there were canals and ditches channeling water. How else could the fields there look green even in times of drought? An agricultural department also distributed improved seed varieties, and government bankers extended loans to those needing them. It goes on, there's a forestry department, all of this, and then here you go. Beggars and destitute people were not seen on any street. All the workers did their work, such as the smiths in the iron-making shops. No obstacles impeded the enlivened literary activities of the country. Freedom to write what one wanted was guaranteed. If their writings conveyed distinct emotions that were novel, pure, and dignified, writers were awarded gold earrings and shawls of honor from the national treasury. Although many spies roamed the streets, never spotting theft or sexual offense, they oft went home to nap. As there were no tax evaders, why would any people need to be apprehended? The duty of the police was simply to see if smoke issued from the kitchen chimneys. So, uh, here's the poet in prison is saying, I'm remembering back to the time of the Buddha, where people could write whatever they pleased, and if what they wrote was beautiful, they would get rewarded with earrings and shawls from the national treasury. And but you can also notice perhaps that, part of what's being set up here, besides like a nice place to insert some social commentary, is also that, this part of the Buddha's, this is really setting up the part of the Buddha's story where he's going to grow up in comfort and ease. And in the earliest texts, that's usually, the classical description is of multiple palaces for the different seasons so that he's physically comfortable all the time and that he's entertained by young people, female musicians, other kinds of, you know, entertainments from being wealthy. But here you really get a picture of, it's not just that he's leaving a life of wealth, of kind of protected wealth and comfort, but also that he's leaving in a certain way the protection of a healthy, well-run state. And we could even say he's leaving being, wealthy in this state, but he's also going forth, to found a community in the wilderness that will be part of this well-run state, right? Because there's ascetics in the woods outside of this beautiful city who are going to come in for alms. His life in the wilderness depends on being in relationship to the cities and the towns. And so the city and town being well run is, intimately linked to what's possible for him and the ascetics once he goes forth and begins to found his community. All right, I want to read one more passage here. It's funny. That was a passage about like the Buddha's not even born yet, and now I want to read about Yasodhara rather than the Buddha. So the Buddha is present all through this, but I want to read you a bit of Yasodhara's grief after the Buddha has left. The moment of the Buddha leaving goes like this. He's left home with his horse Kantaka and his charioteer Chandaka. After taking off his shoes set with pearls and kneeling down on the sand, the Bodhisattva said, just before cutting off his long hair with his sword, "You return now, friend, taking the horse, clothes, ornaments, and back to our country. Go before my father and for me. After respectfully greeting him, you must say, I, Sarvata Siddha, once delivered from old age, birth, and death, when a Buddha I become, will return to see the feet of my father and younger mother. Father, what has happened has passed, so why grieve more? And right after this, you must go to her, companion. Comfort her well and give her this, my message in full. The water of our love, once held in the ocean of my heart, has been evaporated by the sun of universal love. Beloved, raise the sun with all your love and care. We won't live in this life again as man and wife." Hearing this from his master, Chandaka shuddered with fear, then stood speechless before him like a statue, unmoving. The Bodhisattva said, "Delay not returning home with horse, ornaments, clothes." "Permit your servant to follow you, Lord," he said, heaving a long sigh. He replied, "Companion, I won't let you become an ascetic now. You must return to my mother and father to give them my message." He then broke the sacred thread with the hand that was accustomed to cutting bowstrings. On seeing the prince then cutting off his hair with his jewel-tipped sword, the charioteer cried out, "Lord, since your birth now for 29 years I have been in your faithful service. In return I beg you take me with you, only this." He consoled him, "On my return to Kapilavastu, I will certainly invite you to come with me, but now do not tarry and get there quickly." Taking the horse, Chandaka saluted him and with tears streaming, kept glancing behind. Like a lumbering turtle, he returned, just as Gautama went off. They went in opposite directions and both met their horizons. Lamenting over the pangs of their separation, the cricket cries even to this day. And Yashodhara. As always, Gopa woke up early, but on this morning she found the room inert, like a lifeless body. Bitter anguish swept through her mind as she heaved heavy sighs. In all directions she turned, her eyes were wet with tears. She found no morning melody filling the air, and her palace maids were motionless, like figurines on a canvas. Now even figures in scroll paintings drawn by a gifted painter can engender mirth. But these living maids even lacked smiles, much less the urge to move about. One or two standing there had their garments trailing on the ground, as some turned toward the door with their temples supported by their clenched fists. A jade lampstand with extinguished wicks lay on the ground, broken in two. On one side stood a pretty jeweled bowl, next to a gold vessel with a spout. Broken flower garlands were strewn here and there, near other faded flowers cast about, all in a mess. Things were scattered about, but no one there attended to them, as only the heartache agonizing those living there could be seen. It goes on for a while. Here she is. Mm. After the swift currents of unbearable sorrow swept away all her awareness, she fainted and fell onto the luxurious and soft bed. One then immediately brought her a golden urn filled with perfume, then dashed some cold water on her hair, mixing it with the scent. Some of her companions cooled her with yak-tail whisks and other fans. Others forced her to gulp down some water, holding her nose and mouth. Through this first aid, she regained consciousness and opened her eyes, renewed. But Gopa did not eat anything, as though she was fasting. When the infant prince Rahula, Gautama's son, was heard crying, a nurse rushed there and came back holding him. She then took her son and held him close to her heart. Though we know not what her innermost feelings were, she soon burst into sobs. A palace maid consoled her, saying, Lady, Lord, excess crying is no good. Rheumatism may ruin your health, so please eat some food. Look at his face, and please take great solace in your son. Compassionately, Yashodhara replied to her through her crying, This child must certainly be ominous with his father and mother separated like this. Though we have been like milk and water, this one has led to our separation. Alas, when I had this child in my womb, His Highness used to ask, What do you fancy, beloved? When I once said I felt like eating clay, he rushed to serve me bamboo shoots. Alas, who else could ever care for me like this? What misfortune this child has brought! Ill-destined and ill-fated he surely is. We know not what has been written on his forehead. As she then brushed her son's hair with her hand, her lips quivered, and she lamented day and night like this for several days. All right, I want to keep going, but I'm going to pause there for now. Hi. Thanks for joining us for this talk and practice. If these recordings are helpful for you, please consider supporting the Sangha with a donation of any amount. You can find links to our website and the donation page below in the description. Liking and subscribing helps the channel, and I'm grateful for your presence, your practice, and anything you can give to support our little community. Thank you so much. Take care.